Just because she stepped out of the city hall with black skin and a proud posture, Officer Brent Halverson immediately approached her without a warrant and demanded her papers, as if handing down a pre-written verdict of prejudice. He swung his arm, a punch aimed straight at her face. No hesitation, no trace of humanity. But what he didn't know was that the woman he targeted was a senior advisor to the Department of Justice, and her husband was an FBI agent. What punishment awaits the man who believes he has the right to crush others simply because he thinks they'll stay silent forever? Watch until the end for the answer. Lydia Monroe descended the stone steps of City Hall with the composure of someone carrying not just authority, but intent. The portfolio in her hand bore the red seal of the Department of Justice, a symbol not of suggestion, but mandate. Her black, tailored suit gripped her shoulders in silence. Her heels tapped the granite with a rhythm too calm for anyone approaching a war zone. Across the plaza, to the left of the wide circular fountain, Brent Halverson stood half-shaded under the frame of a rusting lamppost, a patrolman in uniform but not in conscience. His sunglasses reflected the midday sun like twin interrogation lights. His mouth twisted slightly as he tilted his head, watching her like a sniper's scope in slow motion. She didn't look his way. She didn't need to. Her gait remained steady, almost mechanical in its certainty. 1-2, 1-2. No hesitation, no glance. Halverson lifted his shoulder, pressed the mic of his radio, and whispered as if his voice alone were a scalpel. Unfit civilian approaching admin zone. Black, alone, arrogant, his tone sliced into the frequency like it belonged on a battlefield, not on a municipal channel. No code, no request for clarification, just a statement, a judgment masked as observation. As Lydia neared the center line of the square, he moved, not rushed, not frantic, just a single step out of the shade and into her path, as if the concrete beneath him had tilted on purpose to intercept her. He stood directly in front of her, with the stiff-jawed stance of a man who'd long confused his badge with a crown. She stopped, not abruptly. She simply ceased to advance, as if her momentum had never truly depended on movement. Her eyes didn't blink, her arms didn't twitch. The only sound was the final click of her heel meeting the pavement as she came to rest an arm's length from his chest. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't state his name. He didn't even nod. Instead, his mouth opened just enough to spill one flat, commanding word into the open air like an ash dropped onto a rug. Identification. There was no urgency in his voice. Only challenge. The kind of word a man throws like a dart at a face he's already sentenced. Lydia remained upright. Her right hand held the folder. Her left arm relaxed at her side. She didn't reach into a pocket. She didn't flinch. She didn't answer. Halverson leaned forward by 1 inch, just enough to mark territory without technically crossing a line. His chin lifted slightly, neck muscles tight, nostrils flared like a wolf pretending not to bare teeth. He looked her up and down in one slow movement, eyes pausing on the seal of the DOJ, then ignoring it as if he were blind by choice. His lips curled, just enough to hint at the contempt buried behind his tone. Lydia's silence wasn't a protest. It was architecture, immovable, designed intact. Her eyes met his now, not in defiance, but in dismissal, not anger, not submission, just a kind of quiet superiority, like someone watching a storm roll in from behind bulletproof glass. She didn't offer her ID yet and didn't speak, not because she couldn't, but because the question didn't warrant an answer, at least not yet. Halverson shifted his weight slightly, squaring his shoulders in that overcompensating way trained into men who've built authority out of silence and fear. His fingers twitched near his utility belt. Not enough to draw, not enough to threaten, but just enough to be noticed. The gesture was calculated, just another unspoken signal in the language of intimidation. Lydia's breath remained even, her chin neither dipped nor lifted. The tension wasn't theatrical. It was surgical, like two tectonic plates pressed flush without a quake. A woman in a light coat passed by 10 feet away, her child pulling on her hand. She looked toward the two figures momentarily, but didn't stop. That was the pattern of the square. People moving, pretending not to see things they didn't want to explain later. The fountain behind them gurgled with indifferent timing, spraying into the air and landing back on itself in loops. No voice interrupted the silence between them. No car horn cut through the air. There was only the scent of sunburned stone and the low thrum of a city watching itself forget how to intervene. "Is there a problem, officer?" Lydia's voice came out cool, shaped perfectly by vocal cords that knew how to walk the line between question and command. No smile, no edge, just a clean, even tone that didn't match the hostility facing her. She hadn't blinked. She hadn't moved. But that one sentence changed the geometry of the moment. Halverson stiffened, just slightly, just enough. His upper lip flexed, almost imperceptibly. He didn't answer. Instead, he repeated, louder this time, as if volume were validation, "I asked for your identification." He didn't move his hand. He didn't name a cause. He didn't cite a reason. He simply restated the demand, framed now as an order. Lydia still didn't flinch. Her folder remained under her arm. Her posture is unchanged. But the space between them had started to shift, an invisible rearranging of who stood in whose shadow. The plaza remained passive. No footsteps rushed in. No voice called out. But Brent Halverson had already committed to the part. He'd written his script before she ever arrived. She was a silhouette, prejudged, pre-filed in a drawer labeled trouble. He didn't need facts. He had her appearance. He didn't need context. He had his perception. And Lydia knew it. He could read it in the squint of his eyes, in the lazy insult of his breath, in the way he stood too close without calling it a confrontation. His badge gleamed in the sun, but it didn't shine with justice. It shone like brass on a weapon kept too clean to question. And still, Lydia didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. Her power wasn't in her voice. It was in her stillness, in her refusal to perform, in the razor-edge distance between his aggression and her calm. She didn't back away. She didn't lean forward. She simply existed, fully and without permission. Brent took a step closer, not enough to violate protocol, but enough to dare her to mention it. His boots thudded against the pavement like punctuation marks. His nostrils flared again. "You hear me?" he asked, not because he needed an answer, but because he needed to feel above her silence. Lydia's expression didn't shift, but her left eyebrow lifted. A single motion so precise it might as well have been a legal objection filed mid-sentence. She reached into her jacket pocket, not rushed, not delayed, and pulled out a slim wallet, embossed in black. She opened it. The seal caught the light, but she didn't offer it forward. She held it in her palm, clearly visible, deliberately still. Satisfied? Her question wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical, delivered with such dryness it sucked the drama out of the moment like air from a vacuum. Halverson's jaw tensed. His eyes scanned the ID, then snapped back to hers. Something behind his irises flickered. Something not quite recognition, not quite retreat, but not victory. She returned the wallet to her jacket with the same steady hand and resumed her stride. 2 steps forward, not fast, not slow. Just enough for him to feel the air shift in her wake. He didn't stop her. He didn't call backup. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, stuck inside the moment he thought he controlled, now watching it pass him like a tide retreating on schedule. She walked past him with the same cadence as before. Tap, tap, tap. No urgency, no retreat, just inevitability. The plaza remained unchanged, but the atmosphere had changed. A man in uniform had tried to draw a line, and a woman in black had stepped across it without lifting her voice, and that, more than any shout, would echo longer in the square. The sound of Lydia's heels had barely faded behind Brent's boots when he found his voice again. But this time it wasn't coded in clipped authority. It came sharpened, louder, hungry for dominance. "Hey!" he barked, his tone no longer that of an officer performing a duty, but of a man cornered by a woman who hadn't flinched when expected. She had dared to speak, dared to ask a question, dared to stand there in silence long enough to make the air between them feel like a verdict. Brent stepped forward, one deliberate pace that shaved away comfort, a move rehearsed through years of learned intimidation. His right hand hovered purposefully close to the holster on his hip, not touching, not drawing, just near enough to breathe the implication. It wasn't a move meant to de-escalate. It was bait, a visual whisper that violence was always a ready option. But Lydia didn't retreat. She didn't blink. Instead, she leaned slightly, not back, not in surrender, but to her right, enough to maintain a span's width between his weapon and her rib cage, as if to redraw the boundary he tried to erase. One small motion, perfectly calculated, perfectly legal. Her silence mocked the threat without naming it. "What's the matter?" Brandt sneered, voice dripping with sarcasm wrapped in asphalt. "Cat got your mouth, counselor? Or are you trying to remember what page in that DOJ rulebook you forgot to memorize?" His words didn't just challenge her credentials, they insulted her presence, her skin, her calm. She met his stare with the patience of someone who'd seen bigger monsters wear shinier medals. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. That restraint unsettled him more than any outburst could have. He leaned closer now, his breath carrying the heat of spoiled confidence. "I know your type," he hissed, and this time the disdain twisted his voice like a blade. "You talk like a lawyer, but walk like you think rules apply to you differently. Hate to break it to you, but out here, nobody gives a damn what titles you put on your little folder, especially when you got a face like that." The insult cracked the air like dry lightning. Lydia stood immovable. Her arms remained by her side, her folder unshaken under her arm, her spine a pillar carved from something Brent couldn't name without fearing it. Just beyond them, a man in a ball cap paused, phone raised, eyes locked on the confrontation. Brent saw it, snapped his head toward the civilian, and jabbed a finger forward. "Put that away before I confiscate it. Last warning." The threat wasn't shouted, it was spat. The syllables brittle and sharp, but the man didn't lower the phone. He didn't move. That silent defiance sparked something in Brent's jaw. He turned back to Lydia, but the ground had shifted. She hadn't moved an inch, yet she was now taller, heavier, louder. Without uttering a word, her voice, when it came, didn't rise. It slid in low and almost intimate in tone, but unshakable in weight. "If this exact footage plays in front of Congress," she said, her words dipped in precision, "how long do you think you'll still be wearing that uniform?" It wasn't a question. It was a prognosis, delivered soft enough to miss, but with edges sharp enough to bleed. Brandt's face twitched, not the whole thing, just the corners of his mouth, the tightness behind his eyes, the way his hand suddenly realized how close it had drifted to his holster. He didn't answer her. He could not without losing control, not without showing how much power had already left him. His gaze darted between her eyes and the camera lens, catching everything from 10 feet away. The sun wasn't hot, but sweat gathered beneath his collar. Lydia didn't wait for his reply. She didn't indulge his silence. Her eyes said enough. They held the same glint as steel behind glass, a strength refined, not paraded. The plaza was no longer a backdrop. It was a courtroom, silent, waiting, and in it stood a woman refusing to be pressed and a man discovering that not every tool on his belt could fix the crack in his authority. Brent tried to recover. "I'm conducting an investigation," he said, louder now, reaching for protocol to cloak his intent. But the lie stank of desperation. His stance betrayed it. His proximity reeked of it. Lydia didn't challenge the statement. She let it rot in the air between them, unacknowledged, unworthy. The tension didn't burst. It solidified, each second adding another inch of ice around the absurdity of the scene. One officer, bristling with ego, barked threats into the silence. One woman, armed only with certainty, refused to cower. She didn't need to threaten. She didn't need to push. Her presence was the challenge. Her restraint was the response. Brant could fill the space with all the noise he wanted, but it wouldn't erase the image now settling into everyone's memory. A badge-wielding man baiting a calm, black woman in broad daylight, reaching for authority like a drunk reaches for dignity. Loud, clumsy, doomed. Lydia adjusted the folder under her arm, a small motion that somehow spoke louder than anything he'd said. She wasn't breaking, she wasn't leaving, and most importantly, She wasn't afraid. Brent's eyes flicked again toward the phone. His power, once assumed, now hung by the thread of an online upload. And still, Lydia said nothing more. She'd given him one line. It was enough. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to teach. She was here, present and unmoved, and that was the thing he couldn't process. He was used to noise, to shouting, to hands raised in surrender or voices cracked from panic, but she gave him none of it. Just a gang-length gap and a look that measured his worth without a single unit of respect. The silence between them throbbed now, not because it was empty, but because it was full of judgment, of pressure, of witnesses who would later say they'd seen a woman stand still while a man tried to make her disappear. Brent opened his mouth again, words loaded and ready, but they stumbled on their way out. Something in her stillness had altered the air. This wasn't just a standoff. It was a test. And with every word he threw, every breath he wasted on assertion, he failed it more spectacularly. Lydia shifted her weight again, this time not to avoid, but to anchor. Her eyes locked on his with the quiet violence of someone who knows the difference between being heard and being obeyed. She wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't explaining herself. She was, simply and irrevocably, there, unbothered, unapologetic. And Brent, for all his fury, for all the veins tightening in his neck and the pulse screaming behind his eyes, couldn't close the distance between who he was and who he thought he'd be in this moment. Because the truth was, he needed her to flinch. He needed her to shout. He needed something to blame. But she didn't give him anything, not 1 inch, not one excuse, just the unbearable mirror of her composure. The silence that followed her question pressed into Brent's skin like heat from a sealed oven, thick, suffocating, exposing. Lydia's words hadn't needed volume. They had carved under his badge like acid beneath enamel. He had faced suspects with knives, protesters with screams, and men twice his size with nothing but a uniform and a bluff. But this woman, silent, poised, black, had dinted something far worse than pride. She'd dismantled his posture without touching him, cracked his performance without raising her voice. And for a man like Brent Halverson, nothing was more dangerous than being seen without control. His lips curled like scorched paper, and then the dam broke. "You think you're better than a cop?" he spat, voice slicing the air with venom, every syllable dripping with insult not born of truth but panic. "You think those fancy files in your little folder will save that smug face of yours?" His hand came up fast, an accusing finger, stiff and aimed like a weapon, landing inches from Lydia's cheek. The gesture wasn't questioning, it was a sentence. His arm shook slightly, not from effort, but from the raw burn of needing her to retreat, needing her to flinch, needing proof that he could still dominate this moment. But Lydia didn't blink. She didn't even tilt her head. The finger hovered before her, but she stood unbothered, unwavering, like a stone sculpted just for this confrontation. "I don't need saving," she said, her voice firm, exact, low enough to still the wind. "I just don't need to be assaulted in daylight." No emphasis, no tremble, no plea, just truth, distilled into something too calm to shout. That sentence cracked through the tension like a match dropped in dry grass. The crowd had begun to gather, first in ones, then in threes. Their eyes found the center of gravity between the two figures. Phones emerged from pockets, lenses lifted without sound, catching the air as it folded inward, watching the crackle before combustion. Brent felt them. Even if he didn't turn, he heard the whisper of screens unlocking, the shift of feet circling behind him. It was the sound of witnesses, an audience he hadn't invited, but now could not shake, and that only fed the fire. "Try me," he barked, his voice no longer postured. This was not a man performing authority. This was a man drowning in it. The edges of his words tore into the air, sharp with a fury that came from impotence, from being held still by someone who wouldn't play the victim he needed. His right shoulder dropped back, left foot anchored, and in a motion as quick as it was reckless, Brent swung. His fist, clenched tight with years of unchecked power and bitter entitlement, sliced through the space between them like a hammer breaking glass. The motion wasn't theatrical. It wasn't a bluff. It was real and fast and aimed, centered on the left side of Lydia's face, 14 inches, where the two entered. That's all that separated impact from escalation. His knuckles cut through the air with brutal precision, every muscle in his arm committing to the punch. The wind followed, sucked in with force, leaving the plaza hanging in suspended breath. Gasps didn't have time to form. No one screamed. No one ran. The world narrowed into that moment, one fist in flight, one woman unmoved. Lydia didn't dodge. She didn't lean back. She didn't brace. She didn't raise a hand. She just stood there, the same gang's length away she had preserved since his first step too close. Her eyes were locked on his, not wide, not wild, just still. The distance between them vanished in a blur of velocity and rage, but it never closed. His punch halted midair, not by contact, not by resistance. It simply hung there, suspended in tension, a breath away from a line he had drawn and crossed in the same second. The punch didn't land, but it changed everything. The sound it made was not one of violence, it was the gasp of restraint lost, the thunderclap of a man who had finally shown his hand and found it shaking. Brent's balance shifted with the swing. His momentum dragged him a half step forward, shoulders exposed, intentions caught under 1,000 pixels now recording in high definition. Behind them, the murmurs swelled, sharp and hushed, like a storm tiptoeing across the pavement. But no one moved. No one intervened. They just watched, stunned, enthralled, bearing witness to a uniform unraveling in real time. And still, Lydia did not move. The punch had come and gone, but her posture had not altered by a degree. Her arms at her sides, her folder is intact, her jaw relaxed, her eyes, those damn eyes, still resting on his, like a surgeon studying something malignant. She didn't need to respond. The scene had already spoken. A white cop, fist flying. A black woman, unshaken. A crowd, watching. A truth, exposed. And Brent Halverson, breathing hard now, eyes flickering from her cheek to the growing circle of phones and eyes and judgment, realized too late that silence could be louder than any siren. His fury, so carefully masked in the language of enforcement, had burst free, and there was no badge big enough to cover what everyone had just seen. The rules he thought bent around him now looped like nooses. The narrative he thought he controlled was slipping through clenched fingers. Because the moment his fist moved, he wasn't the law anymore. He was a man, cornered, exposed, failing. The punch hadn't landed. It hung in the space like a suspended crime, a weapon frozen not by hesitation, but by interruption. And that interruption came not from Lydia's hand, not from the murmuring crowd, but from a voice, sharp, flat, unwavering. Stop. Now. It wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. It cleaved through the plaza like a blade through fog, slicing clean between Brent's knuckles and Lydia's cheek, breaking the moment like glass under pressure. The command didn't rise. It cut. Brent's head jerked sideways, eyes snapping to the left, fists still cocked but suddenly hollow. His body turned as if pulled by an unseen force, drawn not by curiosity, but by instinct, the kind wired into even the most arrogant predator when a bigger presence enters the field. A man stepped out from behind the marble column at the far end of the square. Dark skin, charcoal gray shirt, slate slacks. No rush in his walk, no urgency in his limbs. His hand moved with quiet precision, revealing a leather badge wallet, flipped open mid-stride like a magician revealing the truth. The emblem inside gleamed in the sun. Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation, sealed in blue. He didn't pause to ask questions. He didn't announce himself like a man looking for recognition. He spoke as if authority were something you activated, not explained. You just attempted to strike a special advisor of the United States Department of Justice, he said, tone even, clipped, each word loaded with iron. The effect was immediate. Brent's arm dropped an inch, his spine locked. His mouth hung open just enough to reveal the panic forming behind his teeth. He didn't ask who the man was. He didn't dare. Because whoever he was, he didn't ask Brent for a damn thing. He told him what had just happened, and it was clear from the voice alone that this man wasn't narrating an opinion. He was filing evidence in real time. Lydia turned, finally, but she didn't look at the man. She didn't rush to his side. She simply shifted, one foot sliding half a step backward, not toward safety, but to draw the line sharper. Now Brent stood precisely in the no-man's land between her and the newcomer, a buffer zone carved out of silence and control. Her head turned just enough to expose her profile, but her eyes stayed on Brent. She still hadn't blinked. The man in gray stopped walking. Not abruptly, just precisely. He came to a rest just outside Brent's reach, badge still visible, arms relaxed. His presence rewired the atmosphere. The tension didn't break, it reconfigured. No longer Brent versus silence. Now Brent stood between power unearned and power undisputed. The crowd, sensing the shift, drew in breath collectively. The plaza didn't move, but it tilted. Something had entered the frame that didn't belong in chaos or compliance. Something deliberate, something final. Brent opened his mouth. "Who the hell do you think?" he began. Voice caught halfway between deflection and desperation. The man didn't answer, didn't flinch, just kept his eyes locked on Brent, gaze hard as carbon. It was the kind of look that didn't blink because blinking would waste time. Brent didn't finish his sentence. He didn't need to. The silence that followed swallowed it whole. He shifted his stance, but the authority he'd relied on was gone. Stolen. Dismantled. Replaced by something colder and quieter. The FBI badge might as well have been a guillotine. Quiet, efficient, and irreversible. Marcus, though his name hadn't been spoken, hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't lifted a hand, but in 3 sentences he had redrawn the battlefield. Lydia's presence had held the line. Marcus's presence erased Brent's claim to it. The space between them was now surgical. Each foot, each breath, each pause calibrated to unmask the imbalance. Lydia's slight retreat wasn't surrender, it was reorientation. With Brent caught between 2 unmoving forces, the illusion of control finally shattered, brittle and bare. He glanced again at Marcus's badge, then at the folder Lydia still held. Still pristine, still tucked beneath her arm like nothing had ever threatened to stain it. His mouth opened again, but this time nothing came. No insult, no order, just breathe. Just disbelief, because something in him had registered the shift. He hadn't just failed to strike. He'd been witnessed trying, and not just by phone, by federal eyes. Marcus's final words in that moment weren't for Lydia, weren't for the crowd. They were only for Brent. Not to provoke, not to punish, just to confirm the irreversible. "You crossed a line you were never meant to approach," he said, low and exact, as if documenting it for a report already halfway written. The silence Marcus left behind wasn't empty. It was fully armed. It settled over Brent's shoulders like invisible shackles, pulling his pride into a corner it couldn't claw its way out of. But humiliation is a volatile thing in men who've never learned to digest it. Brent's eyes narrowed. His jaw jutted forward as if trying to reclaim a line already erased. The crowd pressed closer without moving, phones held firm in the air, quiet as courtroom microphones. Brent's voice shattered the stillness. "Who the hell are you to interfere in a police matter?" he barked, loud enough to mask the tremble he couldn't stop at its edge. Marcus didn't blink, didn't tilt his head, didn't even bother lifting his chin. Instead, with the steadiness of someone used to turning silence into a blade, he reached into his back pocket, pulled out a phone, and unlocked the screen with one touch. Then, in a motion that was less gesture than execution, he switched to the front-facing camera, aimed it straight at Brent's face, and said evenly, "You just attempted a deliberate act of violence, in public, in front of civilian witnesses. I am a federal agent, and this is the first piece of evidence." The words landed like cold steel. Precise, deliberate, permanent. Brent flinched, just slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of a reality he hadn't consented to. His body remained in posture, but his mind had already begun to calculate exits, angles, and denials. He looked toward Lydia, still a half-step behind Marcus, her presence undiminished, her eyes no longer locked on Brent, but now resting, not softened, on Marcus's back. Brent saw that look and mistook it for a lifeline. "She yours or something?" he said, voice coiled with sarcasm and something deeper. Confusion disguised as confidence, a last-ditch effort to reframe the narrative he no longer owned. "What is she to you?" Marcus turned his head, just enough to let the words out sideways. Sharp and dry. "She's the person that if you ever touch again, your personnel file will be erased from every server in the Justice Department within 3 minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift his stance. But the temperature dropped like a guillotine's shadow. The line wasn't a threat. It was a mechanism, already primed, already moving. Brent's lips parted, but no sound came. For a second, his brain chased after explanations, protocols, rehearsed defenses, but none of them fit the shape of the moment. Marcus hadn't declared war. He'd declared closure. Not a man trying to dominate, a man simply ending things. And Lydia, still silent, stood like punctuation to a sentence Brent had never understood. Power doesn't always look like volume. Sometimes it's the stillness that speaks last. He blinked, once, then again. But the world around him didn't revert. It didn't correct itself. The crowd had not dispersed. The phones had not dropped. The man before him had not flinched. And the woman he'd tried to reduce to a file number stood taller in his peripheral vision than any badge on his chest. Marcus lowered the phone but didn't pocket it. It remained in his hand, active, glowing, aimed. Brent could feel the lens on his skin like static, and in that glow, every lie he'd ever told in uniform began to sweat through the fabric of his collar. Because for the first time the camera wasn't behind him, it was pointed directly at his instinct. Brent's eyes flicked between the phone still pointed at him and the woman he couldn't break, between the badge that stripped his bravado and the silence that mocked his threats. Logic had already left him. What was left was raw instinct, the kind that reacts not with thought but with the desperate swing of a man drowning in his ego. His fingers shot out without preamble, snatching the edge of Lydia's sleeve as if dragging her back into a world where he still believed he had control. The motion wasn't planned. It was primal, a reflex carved by years of unchecked dominance, the last twitch of authority trying to resurrect itself through physical contact. But the moment his hand closed on her fabric, the world snapped around him. Marcus moved. There was no warning, no shout, no build-up. He crossed the space in a single step, not fast but inevitable, a shift in gravity rather than motion. His hand locked Brent's wrist with surgical precision. The other arm swept under and around, twisting at the shoulder, pivoting Brent off his balance with force not born of anger but of training. Brent's body turned against itself. His knees buckled, his spine bowed. In seconds he was down, face inches from the pavement, the texture of stone scraping his breath. No one shouted, no one cheered, there was no spectacle, only the sound of breath exiting his chest in one violent gasp. Marcus didn't slam. He didn't shove. He applied the maneuver with the brutal clarity of a man who knew exactly how much pressure to use to unmake a threat. His knee hovered just above Brent's back, his grip locked and unwavering. Brent struggled, but the movement was meaningless, more memory than resistance. Lydia stood still, her arm now released, sleeve creased, untouched by panic. Her voice came quietly, deliberately. "You don't have to hurt him." Marcus didn't look up. His tone stayed low, spoken near Brent's ear, measured and final. He needs to understand who's in control. It wasn't said with anger. It wasn't vengeance. It was a structure. Fact stated aloud for the benefit of the man squirming under the weight of his actions. Marcus's hand adjusted slightly, securing the hold, preventing injury without relinquishing the lesson. Brent's face twisted against the sidewalk, jaw clenched, eyes wide, not from pain but from humiliation. The crowd had grown. Phones angled down toward the man, now grounded by consequences. No uniform could protect him from what was being recorded. No badge could explain this frame. He had touched a woman who didn't flinch, and now he was face first in proof that he'd lost more than his temper. He'd lost the myth of power. The weight of Marcus's grip hadn't loosened, but Brent was already collapsing under something heavier: exposure. The pavement no longer scraped just skin, it scraped illusion. The seconds ticked like judgment, and in that stillness came the soft, deliberate crunch of approaching footsteps. Not fast, not rushed, just certain. A uniformed officer stepped into the frame. Not from Brent's side, but from the perimeter Marcus had drawn. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't make a show of hierarchy. He simply stood to Marcus's left and said in a voice low enough to suggest this wasn't for the crowd, "Command just relayed a directive. He's to withdraw from the scene immediately." Brent twisted his neck, face pressed into cement, voice muffled but furious. "You're siding with him?" He spat, the words cracked with betrayal, sharp with disbelief. "You're doing this now? You think he outranks me?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't move. That silence spoke more than any justification could have. Brent's mouth twisted into a sneer as he turned the venom toward Marcus. "You planned this," he hissed. "You set me up." But Marcus, calm as law carved in marble, finally moved, not from his position, but from the quiet he'd held with clinical precision. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The paper was thick. The seal is unbroken. The typeface on the label is printed, not handwritten. Marcus let it hang for a moment in the light, before crouching slightly and placing it, clean and flat, on the sidewalk next to Brent's cheek. "This," he said evenly, "is a copy of your internal summons, initiated 6 weeks ago by the department's Oversight Division. You've been under review for patterns of excessive force, procedural bypass, and racial profiling. You just confirmed every suspicion in real time." Brent froze. Not because he understood the full implications, but because the words hit him like code he hadn't known was being written about him. His eyes flicked to the envelope. His breathing grew louder. Somewhere in his chest, recognition began to bloom, but not the kind that saved you, the kind that came too late. His voice cracked in a half snarl. "No one told me." Marcus didn't blink. "You weren't meant to know. And Spy, we needed the real you to show up." The crowd didn't cheer. The cameras didn't zoom in. But the silence around them changed flavor. No longer shocked, no longer tense. Now it was the silence of vindication, of justice, slowly pressing down on a man who had mistaken volume for protection and routine abuse for untouchable protocol. Brent turned his head toward the officer who had delivered the directive. "You're gonna let him run this?" he demanded. "You're just gonna stand there while he puts on a show?" The officer looked down, eyes blank, mouth unreadable. "It's not a show," he replied flatly. "It's evidence." And in that single line, Brent realized the chain had broken. Not at the link he expected, but at the ones he'd always counted on. No one stepped forward to defend him. No one barked his rank. No one offered to review the body cam footage or call the union rep. His tribe had stepped back. His department had stepped away, and standing over him was the truth he never saw coming, not in the form of bullets or backlash, but in a quiet man with a badge and a sealed envelope. The silence Brent had failed to shatter now pressed around him like a verdict made of air, undeniable, unrelenting. The sealed envelope lay just inches from his face, and in it, everything he thought untouchable had already been documented, reviewed, and set in motion. But denial dies hard in men who wear their authority like armor, and Brent still believed that if he could just touch something, grab, yank, reclaim, he might still claw back the illusion of control. His arm jerked forward toward the file in Marcus's hand, fingers reaching as if to rip open not just the envelope but the truth it carried. But before his hand could make contact, a firm grip wrapped around his wrist and stopped it mid-air. The officer standing beside Marcus didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. His voice was level, official, and final. "You are not authorized to touch federal property." The grip on Brent's arm tightened just enough to make the point clear without crossing into escalation. "This document is under the jurisdiction of federal oversight. You don't get to lay hands on what you no longer have clearance to influence." Brent's face contorted. The words hit harder than any shove. His voice returned in a cracked growl, desperate and defiant. "You're all turning on me?" he hissed. What happened to backing the badge? But the question didn't land. No one bit. No one rushed to reaffirm his place. The silence after it didn't answer. It indicated. And in that moment, Lydia stepped forward. She hadn't spoken in minutes, not because she was absent from the battle, but because she understood timing better than any courtroom strategist. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but not kind. It didn't soothe, it sliced. "You still haven't learned," she said, each word light but surgical, "that not everyone in uniform is right, and not everyone out of uniform is wrong." The sentence fell like a gavel. It didn't need to be raised. It didn't ask permission. It settled over the plaza like a truth that had always been there, waiting to be said. Brent twisted toward her, rage flaring up as the last currency in a bankrupt account. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, voice pitched to intimidate but shaking at the edges. "Who do you think you are?" Lydia didn't blink. She didn't smile. Her response was flat, polished, and merciless. "I'm the one who wrote the protocols you just violated." No embellishment, no inflection, just the clean sound of a woman turning a question into a mirror and handing it back like a sentence. Brent recoiled. Not physically, but internally, visibly. The realization crashing in like a wave against a house built on lies. The badge on his chest suddenly felt smaller. The fabric of his uniform seemed thinner. He'd spent his career believing power came from what he wore. She stood there proving it came from what you knew, what you shaped, what you held steady under fire. Around them, no one clapped, no one spoke. But phones didn't drop. Fingers stayed locked on record. The world wasn't watching a man fall, it was watching a truth rise. And Lydia, for the first time, wasn't being questioned. She was issuing the closing argument. Not in court, but right here, on this cracked piece of city stone. In daylight, the weight of Lydia's words still lingered like the final breath in a courtroom before the gavel drops, but Brent, unable to accept the silence that followed, reached for the one thing he believed would never fail him, his radio. His fingers slid to the shoulder mic clipped to his vest, pressing it with the urgency of a man calling in an airstrike on the truth. "Unit 4, requesting backup," he said, sharp, commanding as if his badge still held sway, as if the uniform still shielded him from the gravity, settling like a noose around his authority. But the only response was static. He pressed again, this time harder, voice rising as desperation cracked through his posture. "This is Officer Halverson. I need immediate backup at Civic Plaza." Nothing, not even a buzz. The line was dead, and with it the last thread of belief that he had someone behind him. Brent turned, eyes darting to the officers still standing nearby. Colleagues who had once slapped his back, laughed at his crude jokes and stood shoulder to shoulder in stage camaraderie, but none moved. No one stepped forward. Their eyes were blank. Their feet were planted. If they heard him at all, they were pretending not to. Marcus spoke then with no shift in tone, no strain in delivery, just cold, flawless execution. "We've been monitoring internal communications since the moment your hand moved toward her." He said it not as a boast, but as confirmation. "You're not on the network anymore. Every frequency you once thought belonged to you has been mirrored, archived, and redirected." He didn't smirk. He didn't flex. He didn't raise the phone, still loosely held in his right hand. He didn't need to. The truth was self-sustaining now. "You're no longer broadcasting, Officer Halverson. You're just talking to yourself." Brent's mouth hung open. He looked down at the radio, then back at the faces around him, searching for one ally, one nod, one flicker of loyalty. Nothing. The men and women in uniform now stood like observers at a funeral. His, not his death, but the burial of his career, his credibility, his illusion. Lydia watched him with a kind of still compassion that felt more devastating than fury. Then she stepped forward, not to confront, but to clarify. Her voice was quieter than before, but no less sharp. "You weren't trapped," she said, her gaze steady. "No one forced your hand. No one lured you here. No one baited you into throwing a punch or grabbing me. This wasn't a setup." She let the silence stretch just long enough for her next sentence to land like a blade laid gently across the throat. "You walked into your trap and pulled the trigger." There was no shout, no applause, no chaos. just the echo of that sentence curling into Brent's bones like cold air beneath a locked door. He had always believed in backup, always believed that his mistakes would be papered over by the Brotherhood of Silence, the Fraternity of Blue. But silence had turned on him. The Brotherhood had turned its back, and now he stood entirely alone, not because the world had betrayed him, but because he had finally run out of people willing to lie for him. He had always believed that silence could be bent, that with the right tone, the right barked order, the right gleam of a badge, silence could be trained to obey. But as Brent stood in the middle of the plaza, his authority hollow, his voice spent, his badge irrelevant, he came to understand that silence doesn't obey, it waits. And now it was waiting for Lydia Monroe. She didn't announce her exit, she didn't gesture for clearance, she didn't even glance back. She simply walked, her heels tapping a rhythm that no longer had to compete with anyone's voice. The door to the administrative building ahead of her, one that hours ago might have required identification, explanation, permission, opened without hesitation. No one stopped her, no one called out. The building took her in like it had been waiting for her all along. Behind her, Brent remained rooted to the concrete. No cuffs, no hands on his shoulders, no restraint, just the weight of irrelevance, heavier than any shackle. The people who had once called him sir, who had laughed with him, covered for him, and turned away from his shortcuts now stood off to the side. They weren't shielding him, they weren't speaking for him, they weren't even speaking to him. But their silence was not apathy, it was judgment. Passive, still, and absolute. The cameras remained, dozens now. The eyes of every smartphone lens locked onto Brent like spotlights aimed at a stage actor who had forgotten his lines. He stood there, exposed not by violence but by a complete absence of validation. His mouth twitched, opened slightly then closed. His hands hovered at his sides, unsure whether to fold or gesture. He looked at the door Lydia had disappeared through, but it was closed now, and with it the world he thought he knew. Marcus hadn't moved. He stood a few paces back, relaxed, the picture of patience wrapped in certainty. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't rise. It was casual, clinical, almost kind. "You're not under arrest. Not yet." He let the sentence breathe, let the cameras hear it. "But you will be hearing every word you've ever shouted at a suspect, every threat, every slur, every order you barked, thinking no one recorded. 40 tapes, 40 separate incidents, all of them filed, all of them time-stamped. All of them yours." Brent didn't answer. He didn't even blink, because it wasn't a threat. It was a future, clearly outlined, signed, dated, and sealed. Marcus didn't need to argue. He didn't need to moralize. The data would speak louder than anything either of them could say. Brent's breath caught. For the first time in years, there were no policies to twist, no chain of command to hide behind, no paper trail to bury. The only thing that surrounded him now was truth. And cameras. Always cameras. Above them, a breeze stirred the edges of the plaza, tugging gently at the hem of Marcus's jacket. The scene wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it was irreversible. Brent had lost nothing that could be physically taken. His uniform was still on, his hands were free, his feet unshackled, but everything that had once made him untouchable had been peeled away without a single raised voice. Power hadn't yelled, it had been documented. By the time the sun dipped below the courthouse dome, casting long shadows across the stone that had borne witness to silence sharper than any shout, the footage had already crossed state lines. It wasn't leaked, it didn't need to be. It surged, one clip 39 seconds long, filmed from a civilian phone on the south side of the plaza, framed by shaking hands and the occasional gasp. There was no editing, no overlays, no commentary, just raw capture. Brent's voice rising, Marcus stepping in, and Lydia Monroe still, upright, untouched, never blinking, never retreating, never breaking. That was the moment that lit the match. The video didn't go viral because of the chaos. It didn't trend because someone got tackled or because someone bled. It exploded because Lydia didn't move. Not when the insults came, not when the fist was cocked, Not when a uniformed authority tried to make her small. She didn't duck. She didn't flinch. She stood there with a calm so complete, so defiant in its serenity, that it rewrote the rules of how strength is seen. The internet didn't care about Brent's shouting. It cared about her silence. It didn't share the swing of a punch. It shared the power of a woman who made the ground tremble by refusing to yield. Hashtags came like lightning. Power and stillness surged through timelines. Commentators posted freeze frames of Lydia's expression, calm, unreadable, unmovable. Some circled the tilt of her head, the set of her jaw, the unwavering line of her gaze. Others simply let the image speak for itself. News anchors replayed the clip in slow motion, looping the moment Brent's arm stopped mid-air and the moment Lydia didn't even blink. Panelists on national broadcasts spoke less about justice and more about composure, less about confrontation, and more about what it meant to stare down decades of institutional intimidation and not even shift your weight. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply endured. And in a world accustomed to fireworks and breakdowns, the restraint was electric. The clip was dissected by analysts, voice coaches, and body language experts. Primetime specials ran digital breakdowns, mapping micro-expressions like blueprints to revolution. But no matter how much they analyzed her stillness, they never found weakness. They found control, poise, authority forged not in sound, but in refusal. She became a case study overnight, not in protest, but in presence, not in resistance, but in refusal to vanish. Lydia Monroe, special advisor to the Department of Justice, didn't make a speech. She didn't rally a movement. She didn't ask for the spotlight. She simply stood in it and let the world decide whether or not it had the courage to look her in the eyes. And the world did. The world didn't wait. It never does. By the time Brent Halverson woke the next morning, the video had already clocked over 17 million views. News cycles spun effortlessly without the need for new footage, relying instead on new voices to reinterpret what had already burned itself into the collective retina of a restless public. But Brent didn't turn on the television. He didn't check his phone. He didn't even glance at the emails piling up under the blinking red light on his inbox. He believed, like many men trained to mistake silence for safety, that if he just kept walking the line he'd always walked, the system would adjust for him like it always had. That the walls wouldn't move just because the crowd had. That the institution he once served wouldn't abandon him simply because the public did. He dressed with muscle memory, pressed uniform, polished shoes. The same badge was clipped to the same spot on his chest. He checked the alignment in the mirror twice, not because he cared how it looked to others, but because it reminded him who he believed he still was. He walked up the steps of the precinct like a man returning from approved leave, confident, chin up, shoulders squared. There was no hesitation in his stride, only the ritual of habit. The same entrance he had passed through for over a decade loomed ahead, glass doors tinted just enough to suggest authority without offering transparency. He pulled his ID from his pocket, the standard issue blue and gold laminate, edges worn down from years of use, corners curled slightly like the rules he used to bend. It was familiar in his hand. His thumb ran over the surface like it might activate muscle memory in the door itself. He pressed it to the scanner beside the entry turnstile, already composing in his mind the conversation he'd have inside, already imagining the nods he'd receive from behind desks and monitors. The scanner responded with a sound, not the expected welcome chime, not the soft confirmation of belonging. It was a beep, sharp, quick, and unmistakably red. Brent stared at it. The turnstile remained locked. He tried again. Better. Red. The sound felt louder the second time, not because it was, but because silence had now gathered behind him, pulling at the edges of the moment. Someone cleared their throat a few feet away, and another officer brushed past without stopping, their ID lighting the scanner green before the glass doors hissed open to let them through. Brent pressed his card one more time, this time with the frustrated insistence of a man trying to slam shut a door that had already locked behind him. Leap, the turnstile disguised as color, but now the machine's refusal wasn't mechanical. It was symbolic, a verdict, disguised as a color. The machine's refusal rendered in 3 letters of color. Scratched around the edges, familiar in his grip, the badge now felt foreign. Brent's thumb lingered over it, as if trying to rub the error out of the chip, but the system didn't stutter. It didn't hesitate. It denied him with the same clinical finality it offered every other officer, except today he was no longer one of them. The rejection hadn't raised alarms, but it had sent a message. He turned slightly, catching the eyes of 2 officers near. Neither met his gaze. One turned to check something on a clipboard that didn't need checking. The other adjusted their belt and moved toward the elevators with forced casualness. No one asked him if he needed help. No one asked why the scanner failed. They already knew. He shifted his stance, jaw tightening. His instincts told him to speak, to call someone over, to demand this be fixed. But the instinct was too slow. A voice had already come from his left. "They already pulled your access." The tone was flat. A neutral line cut across the air. Brent turned, expecting irritation or sarcasm, something he could grip and throw back. Instead, he saw Officer Carlson. Carlson, who used to drink with him after late shifts. Carlson, who once whispered about cover-ups with a laugh. Carlson, who now didn't flinch, didn't smirk, didn't stop walking. Brent blinked. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to add authority to the question, but it fell short. Thin, weightless, Carlson kept moving, offering only the sentence he'd been told to repeat. "You've been flagged for administrative isolation, effective this morning." Brent followed him a step, incredulous. "No one told me." The words left his mouth like an accusation, like a flaw in the process had just revealed itself, and he could use it to wedge himself back in. Carlson didn't even turn. "They don't have to." The statement froze him in place. His eyes dropped to the badge again. It hadn't changed. It looked the same. But now it was just plastic, just a name and a photo, a formality from a past that no longer counted. The silence around him was thicker now, not curious, not concerned, just present. Brent looked up and watched another officer walk past. She didn't slow, she didn't glance. Her badge lit the scanner green without resistance. The turnstile opened. She walked through, and Brent stood still, a red echo pinned to his hands. Each second that passed added weight to the reality that no one was coming to fix this. No one was pulling strings in the background. No one was making calls. There was no system error. There was only a system that had chosen to stop recognizing him, and it had done so with a tone, not a trial. Brent stepped back from the scanner, card still in hand, fingers now curling tighter around it, not to protect it, but as if strangling it might restart something. When nothing changed, he turned away from the turnstile, pivoting toward the side entrance, a door reserved for public visitors, those without clearance. It felt wrong walking that path, not because of policy, but because of what it implied. He was no longer above it, no longer part of the system that filtered others. Now he had to walk through what used to be the line he manned. The glass door opened with a hiss when the receptionist buzzed it, mechanically polite. Brent stepped through, his uniform still crisp, badge still gleaming. But in this space it read more like a costume than authority. The security guard at the front desk glanced at him, offered a vague nod, then returned to his clipboard. Brent opened his mouth to ask something, anything, but no words landed. His questions were no longer requests. They were interruptions. He moved down the hallway, past posters he had memorized years ago, guidelines for use of force, disciplinary flowcharts, PR statements about public trust. Now they loomed larger, more mocking. One poster in particular caught his eye, a blown-up photo of officers with arms around school kids, the caption reading, "Here to serve, here to stay." Brent's reflection hovered faintly on the glass frame, disjointed by the lights above. He kept walking, pacing toward the internal wing he knew best. His boots echoed down the linoleum stretch, steady but no longer confident. At each checkpoint he hesitated, half expecting a hand to stop him, half hoping one would, but no one did. That was worse. By the time he reached the bullpen, the rhythm of work inside hadn't paused. Phones rang. Keyboards clacked, voices rose and fell, but none of it belonged to him anymore. No heads turned. No one tracked his arrival, not in the way they once had, acknowledging him with the grudging respect of someone with reach. Now, they just passed over him like air. The desk he once claimed was still there, but it had been stripped. No nameplate, no photos, no worn mug that said, "I don't need coffee, I need compliance." Only a clean surface, reset for reassignment. He stood still in front of it, fingers twitching slightly, unsure whether to touch it or walk away. In the end, he did neither. He turned his head, scanning the room for a familiar face that might break ranks and offer clarity. None did. Brent finally turned his back to the bullpen, the hollow sound of his footsteps escorting him down the corridor like a silent parade. No one called after him. No one followed. Even the air seemed thinner here. He reached the hallway that led to internal affairs. The door at the end, usually propped ajar with careless indifference, was now firmly shut. On it, taped squarely in the center, was a plain sheet of white paper, typed in all caps, no logo, no signature, just state full Turner review. Officer Brent Helverson. Unfreezing process. All conflict files on record, dating back to 2018. The paper did not scream. It didn't need to. Its stillness was louder than any accusation. Brent stared at it, unmoving. For once, the badge clipped to his chest felt heavier than metal. Its weight had flipped. It was no longer proof of belonging, but a marker of everything now under scrutiny. He reached for the doorknob out of habit. Locked. Of course it was. His access didn't stretch here anymore. The symbol couldn't have been clearer. Not only had he been removed from the room, he had been erased from the process entirely. The hallway behind him remained empty. The people inside that office, his people, had shut the door on their own, and in that quiet moment, there were no raised voices, no slammed fists, no broken phones, only that cold, indifferent sheet of paper. Not a verdict, not a declaration, just a door, and it didn't open. The report arrived with the finality of a gavel striking hardwood, precise, unflinching, and unmistakably damning. On official letterhead from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the 12-page document was not labeled investigation or incident review, but something colder. Pattern of violation, internal protocol. Officer Brent Helverson. The subject line alone set the tone. The body made it clear 20 arrests under Officer Halverson's authority had breached at least one core protocol. None had video corroboration. None were processed with a signed warrant. 8 lacked supervisory clearance. And in the margins of multiple intake forms, there was Brent's handwriting, scrawled quickly, like a man writing the same lie over and over until he believed it. Subject resisted arrest. Displayed aggressive behavior, required escalation. These notations had once justified bruises, detainments, and silence. It didn't help Clinton. Now they exposed a sequence, a loop, a pathology. But it wasn't just what was there. It was who. 12 out of 20 victims were African-American males between the ages of 17 and 35. 4 had died in custody. One, David J. Halloway, sustained permanent brain damage after being slammed into a squad car head first. He hadn't spoken since. The others bore less visible scars, lost jobs, dropped scholarships, family estrangements, fractured trust. And yet, every report echoed the same phrase. Subject was combative, intervention required. No body cams, no bystanders interviewed, no follow-ups, just forms with ink and initials. The evidence wasn't speculative, it was archival. It came from Brent's own hands, his pen, and that made it unshakable. The red ink used by federal auditors to annotate his reports now looked like blood on paper. It circled phrases, boxed timestamps, annotated check boxes with one merciless word, invalidate. The press didn't need to speculate. The document spoke louder than any anchor ever could. Newsrooms ran the scans unedited, letting the images of redacted names, forensic notations, and procedural breakdowns bleed across the screen. Commentators didn't offer outrage, they offered silence, interrupted only by the turn of each new page on air. The story was no longer about Brent. It had become about pattern, about the ease with which authority becomes habit and habit becomes harm. Civil rights attorneys began circling the dates, matching them with public complaints that had been dismissed for lack of evidence. But now the evidence was there, in Brent's handwriting, in timestamps he never thought would be cross-referenced, in the grainy records of procedural shortcuts no one had questioned until now. One former officer, anonymously interviewed, summed it up with brutal clarity. He didn't think he was lying. He thought he was the law. The department's PR team released a 3-line statement by noon. "We are cooperating fully with the federal review. Officer Halverson is on administrative leave pending the outcome. The department remains committed to justice and accountability." No mention of the victims, no apology, just an administrative pause between disasters. One victim's sister, whose brother had been rendered mute, stood outside a courthouse with the file clutched in her hand. She didn't cry, she just said, "We told them. Years ago, we told them." Reporters didn't ask questions, they just let the cameras roll. That afternoon, a coalition of civil rights organizations filed a class action suit against the city. The filing cited not just negligence, but institutional complicity. In less than 48 hours, Brent went from badge-wielding enforcer to centerpiece in a federal inquiry, not because of a single act of brutality, but because the system had finally turned its gaze inward. And what it found wasn't one man's failure, it was a ritual of disregard, performed with a pen and a check. Each signature he left was now a scar on a ledger that had never truly been closed. The media called it the Ledger Reckoning. Advocacy groups called it proof. Brent had no comment. He hadn't been seen since the report dropped. And for the first time, perhaps in years, the silence that followed him was not the product of fear. It was the sound of a machine finally stalling under the weight of its record. Internal Affairs had reviewed hundreds of hours of dispatch audio, internal chat logs, and metadata trails connected to Brent's shift patterns. The more they uncovered, the more apparent the choreography became. Stops were targeted, reports were templated. Evidence was seldom logged. For a man so aggressive in the field, Brent had mastered the art of bureaucratic camouflage. He kept his offenses just shy of overt, just beneath the threshold where protocol became prosecution. That subtlety had been his shield, until now. The Bureau's cross-examination didn't seek confession. It showed correlation, and correlation, when layered across time, became intent. One memo in particular cracked open the structure. A July 2019 email from a precinct supervisor to a legal officer, in which Brent's aggressive language during arrests was flagged. The supervisor's note: "Not worth pursuing. Subject is always combative per his reports." That line became a quote for a viral editorial titled, "How Forms Become Weapons." In it, the author wrote, "When your system trusts ink over voice, it's not justice, it's automation." Brent's defenders, few and far between, scrambled for cover. A union spokesperson argued that high-stress enforcement scenarios often lead to misinterpretations, but no one could misinterpret the statistics. The racial skew was indefensible. The handwritten notes betrayed something even deeper: assumption, presumption of threat, presumption of resistance, presumption that his version of events would never be questioned. He'd been right for years, he was just wrong now. More names emerged. One by one, the lives behind the files surfaced. Gregory Lane, detained without cause at 17, missed his college interview. Omar Richards, held in a squad car for 3 hours because Brent smelled marijuana. No substance was found. DeAndre Hill, a youth counselor, arrested outside his community center during a noise complaint. The center was silent. No charges were ever filed. These weren't outliers. They were patterns of choice disguised as chaos. A nonprofit watchdog group built an interactive map of Brent's activity over 4 years. Heat zones pulsed where incidents clustered, low-income neighborhoods, majority-minority blocks, areas historically over-policed. With one glance, viewers could see where Brent patrolled and where discretion disappeared. The data didn't tell a story, It screamed one. An internal memo from a federal ethics analyst stated flatly, Officer Halverson's arrest history reflects not a series of isolated misjudgments, but a sustained campaign of procedural disregard masked by bureaucratic compliance. No softening, no hedge, just a sentence heavy with verdict. On the 5th day after the report's release, Brent's photograph was removed from the precinct wall, not because he'd been fired yet, but because the station had become a site of protest. Dozens stood outside with printed copies of the arrest forms, laminated and hung from clotheslines like a courtroom's wash of confession. One protester held up a sign made from one of Brent's statements. Required escalation. Below it, the words, for whom, for what, for how long. The tragedy wasn't just in the force he used. It was in how easily he'd gotten used to using it. His confidence had been bolstered not just by power, but by the silence around him. Supervisors had seen the patterns. Peers had heard the whispers. No one had acted. Now that silence, too, stood on trial. The national spotlight turned its unflinching glare on every name Brent had ever written, every initial he'd scrawled beside a checkbox, every instance he'd marked subject became uncooperative, required force. Independent legal analysts re-reviewed archived dashcam footage that had been dismissed as inconclusive. In 2 cases, new audio filters revealed background voices pleading with Brent to de-escalate. In another, a grainy image frame showed a teenager raising both hands moments before he was tackled. These weren't technicalities, they were thresholds crossed, silently cataloged, until someone had the nerve to rewind. One file, labeled Case 1014A, caught particular attention. It involved a young woman, 22, who had been stopped on her way home from a late shift at a nursing center. Brent's report claimed she displayed erratic behavior and resisted questioning, but her lawyer produced GPS data, voice messages, and security footage from a local bodega that showed she had complied, spoken clearly, and was never even told why she was being detained. The footage showed her quietly sobbing on the sidewalk, hands behind her back, as Brent stood over her, flipping through his citation pad. The charge never made it to court, but the scar was public now. Televised panels dissected his syntax. Why does he always write, displayed signs of aggression? One anchor asked. A civil rights attorney replied, because it's unprovable. That's the point. You can't cross-examine a feeling. The audience didn't need more convincing. The mood had shifted. Brent wasn't just a bad apple. He had been the rot in the barrel no one dared smell. Internally, precinct staff who had once turned a blind eye began submitting statements. One said she had flagged Brent's conduct to Human Resources, but was told he was too effective on the street to sideline. Another recalled overhearing Brent boast about his arrest quotas during lunch breaks, calling himself the filter this city needs. The worst quote came from a body cam technician who had fixed Brent's units. His body cam broke so often, we called it convenient blind. The public pressure built with clinical momentum. Civil litigation flooded the courthouse. The department's legal team began triage, settle quietly, admit no fault, preserve institutional face. But in the age of open records, every no comment fed the fire. Meanwhile, Lydia remained silent intentionally. She issued no interviews, no statements, no social media responses. But her composure had become emblematic. College students cited her in ethics essays. An art exhibit titled The Stillness Doctrine used her likeness, standing in black and white, hands at her sides, eyes forward, as its centerpiece. Her stillness was no longer just restraint, it was resistance. In a memo leaked from Capitol Hill, a senior justice advisor wrote, "The Lydia Monroe incident will define this administration's legacy on law enforcement reform." The irony was clear. Brent had tried to reduce her to a file number. Now his reports were being dissected under the national microscope. One of the final nails came not from the Bureau, but from a community foundation that had tracked misconduct settlements. They released a chart comparing Brent's arrest record to departmental averages. The deviation was glaring. Either he was the only one doing his job, or he was the only one doing it wrong, the caption read. Underneath, a list of the 4 deceased. Names, ages, and last words where available. One simply read, "Did I do something?" No dramatization could surpass that. No editorial needed extra spin. The truth, laid bare in Brandt's handwriting, had already written his obituary. By the time the internal tribunal convened for the preliminary review, Brandt's face was no longer just recognizable. It was radioactive. No union rep accompanied him to the hearing. The seat beside him remained empty, a visual confirmation that even those paid to defend had drawn a moral line. The room was sealed. No cameras allowed, but leaks are inevitable when silence becomes complicit. Clerk's note circulated online within hours, quoting a line from Brandt's defense. "I never knew they would take it this far." The response, reportedly from a female investigator, was curt. "You never knew because you never had to ask." Outside, protesters held photos of the victims. Not glamorized headshots, just real faces, unfiltered and familiar. School portraits, driver's license IDs, even a crumpled Polaroid from a father who never deleted his son's last birthday photo. The crowd wasn't enormous, but it didn't need to be. Its stillness, again, said everything. One by one, survivors and their families began releasing their statements. A mother spoke on the steps of the courthouse, holding up the page Brandt had written the phrase "non-compliant subject" on. "This is my son," she said. "This is what non-compliant looks like to them," a 17-year-old who asked why he was being detained. Her voice didn't tremble, it thundered in its clarity. Legal analysts described Brandt's reports as mirrors turned inward, not reflections of reality, but projections of fear, power, and unchecked bias. His phrasing became forensic evidence. The red ink that once closed cases now opened new wounds. Every mark, every scribbled line had been a silent gavel pounding down on people who never stood a chance. And then came the report. Compiled by an independent review board, the 312-page dossier detailed procedural failures, abuse of authority, repeated patterns of racial targeting, and a chronic absence of oversight. Brandt had been flagged by 3 separate oversight tools, all overridden by supervisors citing operational necessity. The system hadn't just failed to stop him, it had greased the wheels. The most harrowing section covered the man who lost his ability to speak. His sister read his statement aloud at a press conference, her voice cracking but never breaking. "He wants you to know he remembers the sound of Brandt's boot before it struck him. He remembers the words, 'Stop resisting,' screamed as he lay still. He remembers silence and now lives inside it." The statement ended not with blame but with a call to truth. "We don't want revenge. We want names. We want admissions. We want a registry, so this never happens again." It was signed for those still breathing. Inside the department, desks once bustling with routine began to quiet. Officers started auditing their case files, some with visible shame. A few offered to testify voluntarily. Others filed for transfers. A culture that had long operated under loyalty was now learning that loyalty without conscience is just silence in uniform. Brandt was officially suspended without pay. No press conference announced it, no camera caught his walkout, but an internal email confirmed it. Status change, administrative leave pending federal proceedings. The machine had stopped shielding him. The wall cracked. And as Lydia walked past the front steps of her office, reporters still clustered, still hungry for a quote, she said nothing. Her silence wasn't an absence. It was authorship. This was her design, not to scream, not to strike, but to set a system in motion that would eventually eat the rot it had ignored. One last detail leaked. A memo from the Chief of Internal Affairs, included at the end of Brandt's personnel file. It read simply, "The ink was always red. We just chose not to see it." She had written hundreds of briefs in her life, most of them sharper than scalpels, armed with precedent and pressure, meant to sway verdicts, rewrite outcomes, or dismantle the language of oppression by turning it against itself. But this letter, short, inked in her hand, not on official stationery nor intended for public eyes, was different. It sat in the center of her desk, undated, unsigned. No salutation, no recipient, just a message left behind like a flare dropped into a void. I used to believe justice would find its way, but maybe sometimes it gets lost. This time, I lit the path. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't for the press or a committee or a cause. Lydia had written it quietly, after the storm, when the chaos had thinned out and her office stood still like a courtroom after the verdict had rung. The day had slipped into dusk without fanfare. She hadn't turned on the lights. The letter didn't demand anything. It didn't beg for recognition. It didn't seek redemption. It was a reminder, etched not in rage, but resolve. The walls around her still bore traces of that week's tension, fragments of headlines printed out and pinned by aides who thought visibility was a measure of victory, reports on Brent Halverson's administrative review, footage timestamps, social media virality metrics. But her eyes weren't on any of them. Her attention belonged only to the words on that page. Marcus found it later that evening. He wasn't looking for a note, only for Lydia. The room was cold, empty, untouched, but the letter lay precisely aligned at the center of her desk, not a word out of place. He didn't open a drawer or call her name. He stood there for a full minute, absorbing the silence the letter radiated. Then he took a photo, saved it to his phone, and made it his home screen. Not to share, not to post, to keep, to hold on to the essence of why they did what they did. A private totem of purpose. That letter spoke more than any hearing transcript could. It captured the cost of restraint in a world that mistook silence for surrender. In just a few lines, Lydia acknowledged what so many in her position feared admitting aloud, that law alone wasn't enough, that procedure wasn't protection, that system didn't self-correct. They had to be confronted, even by those who had helped design them. It was not a letter of apology, not a confession. It did not center on pain. It declared its presence. Lydia had stepped out of the shadows of procedural neutrality and placed herself deliberately, unmistakably, on the side of confrontation. Her silence, once worn like armor, had been laid down. She had spoken by not speaking. She had acted by standing. And now she had written, not to the world but to the future. Marcus folded the letter without creasing it, slid it into a sleeve, and placed it inside his wallet. A former soldier turned agent, he had kept only two things in that wallet for more than a decade: his father's unit coin, and now this. They didn't speak that night when Lydia returned home. She saw it in his eyes. He had read it, and that was enough. The letter didn't circulate. It didn't leak. It didn't need to. Its presence was felt in every meeting Lydia entered afterward, every pause before she answered a question, every silence she let stretch. She was no longer the quiet counsel with a folder full of statutes. She was the one who had once written, "I lit the path," and people noticed. A junior staffer found herself whispering the words at her desk one morning, after watching another department head fumble through a moral evasion. A clerk had it printed in tiny font and slipped it into the lining of her planner. No one talked about the letter aloud, but everyone who had seen it remembered it. It was not revolutionary in volume. It was devastating in clarity. Lydia never brought it up again. She didn't need to. Actions continued where letters left off. Her stances hardened. Her questions cut deeper. Her refusals to placate became a quiet policy. She stopped asking whether her presence made colleagues uncomfortable and began wondering why she had ever cared. The silence that once protected her now served another purpose. It sharpened the echo of her words when she finally chose to speak. Somewhere along the way, the letter was quoted in a legal ethics seminar. No attribution, no acknowledgement, just written on the whiteboard in a professor's careful script. "I used to believe justice would find its way." The class sat with it for 5 minutes in silence, tasked with reflecting on what it meant when justice needed to be guided, not just applied. It became part of the quiet canon, not chanted in protests, not sung in campaigns, just passed, hand to hand, breath to breath, in the spaces where people who know the system's cracks try to hold it together with will and wit alone. For Lydia, it marked a line in time. There was her life before the letter, when she believed documentation could deflect violence, that reports could resist abuse, that promotion inside the system was progress, and there was everything after, where she walked knowing that her calm could disarm but would not deter cruelty, that policy could be precise but still be ignored, that the only way to guard others was to sometimes become the weapon yourself. That was the lesson Brent Halverson had taught her, though he never meant to, that silence could be lethal, that complicity wore uniforms, that prejudice had a protocol, and that sometimes standing still while a system spun itself into panic was the most powerful resistance of all. The letter stayed in Marcus's wallet for years. Through hearings, through reforms, through reassignment, he never removed it. He would, on certain long nights, slide it out and reread it, not to mourn, not to wonder, but to remember that she had written it before anyone knew what it meant, before the hashtags, before the headlines, when it was still dangerous to believe too deeply in anything not already printed in a statute book. The system would change after that, slowly, painfully. Some doors would open, some names would fall, some rules would rewrite themselves, but those were ripples. The stone had already been cast, quietly, on a desk, on an evening when no one watched, and all it said was, "This time, I lit the path." The letter sat on Lydia's desk, untouched and unread by anyone but her. No press release, no leaks, no fanfare. Just the kind of silence that feels like thunder if you know where to listen. And in the aftermath of that silence, in the cold fluorescent glare of a federal hearing room, another kind of reckoning was beginning. Not with fists or cameras, but with transcripts, signatures, and the slow peeling away of official masks. The committee room wasn't large, but it felt cavernous under the scrutiny of the moment. A dozen high-backed chairs faced a witness table. The man who walked into the room was graying, lean, still moving like someone who thought a straight back could defend a crooked record. Captain Douglas Merriman, retired precinct commander, took his seat with the poise of a man who once gave orders without challenge. Now, there were microphones angled toward him, and behind the glass, a line of reporters waited for the sentence that would crack open a system. "Captain Merriman," the lead investigator began, "you were the supervising officer for Officer Brent Halverson from 2015 through late 2019, is that correct?" Merriman adjusted his tie. "Yes, that's accurate. Do you recall a citizen complaint filed against Officer Halverson on May 12, 2016, alleging excessive force against a detained individual?" A pause. Then, with a measured breath, "Yes, I remember. You chose not to act on that complaint. Why?" The silence in the room could have drowned a whisper. Merriman didn't blink. "Because at the time, I believed Officer Halverson's behavior was overly enthusiastic, not malicious. I thought he was just," he hesitated, "too aggressive for his good." "You mean too aggressive for the badge?" Merriman didn't answer. He looked down, then up again. "No, I mean what I said. He was too aggressive, but not criminal. Do you believe now, with the benefit of hindsight and evidence, that your decision not to pursue that complaint helped enable further misconduct?" Merriman shifted. "I made the best judgment I could with what I had, but you didn't open an internal investigation. You didn't request footage. You didn't follow up with the complainant. The file was closed within 48 hours. Merriman clenched his jaw. That was procedure at the time. "No, Captain, that was discretion. And that discretion became the gate Brent Halverson walked through, unchecked, into 24 questionable arrests, 4 civilian deaths, and a silent epidemic of violence. Under the color of law." Across the room, Marcus sat behind the glass partition, hands folded. He didn't need to speak. Lydia had spoken without speaking, and now the system that once insulated itself with silence was being forced to listen to its echoes. "Do you regret your decision, Captain Merriman?" The man's voice cracked, just barely. "I regret trusting instinct over facts." That single line, 7 words, would be quoted, dissected, mocked, and memed by midnight. But it wasn't the worst of it. That came seconds later, when a committee member leaned in and asked, "What was it about that first complaint that didn't raise an alarm?" Merriman's answer dropped like a brick in water. Because the subject was combative. Loud, I assumed he provoked the situation. A murmur rippled through the spectators. One of the councilwomen narrowed her eyes. The subject, sir, was 17, handcuffed, and suffering from a diagnosed cognitive disorder. Merriman froze. "You didn't know that because you didn't check," she continued. "You didn't ask. And now we know, because of federal cross-referencing, that teenager's family tried 3 times to file a follow-up. They were turned away each time, by your front desk, under your watch." There was no redemption in Merriman's silence, just weight, just the thud of unspoken complicity. In the back row, a young journalist typed the word that would become her headline before the gavel ever dropped. From overly aggressive to murder the cost of one man's silence. But it wasn't just about Brent Halverson anymore. It was about the culture that trained him to grin while pressing a knee against someone's neck. About the chain of command that looked away as long as the arrest reports were clean and the paperwork timely. The hearing was peeling back layers, not just of one man's guilt, but of an institution's reflection. More would come. Documents, timestamps, internal memos marked for review that were never reviewed. But for now, what mattered was this. Merriman had testified, and in doing so, he had passed a sentence on himself. The hearing room seemed to contract with every second that passed. The tension no longer hung. It pulsed, thick and immediate, as if the air itself was being held hostage by an invisible truth about to erupt. The chairman of the ethics subcommittee, a woman with gray braids and steel-rimmed glasses, adjusted her microphone and leaned forward. "Captain Ellis," she said. Her voice clipped. "Are you stating under oath that your inaction was based on an assumption rather than evidence about Officer Halverson's behavior?" Ellis's lips parted, but no sound came. He reached for the glass of water beside him, lifted it, and held it mid-air, forgetting to drink. "At the time," he croaked, "I believed the incident didn't warrant escalation." The committee lawyer cut in, tone razor clean. "And that incident was a use-of-force complaint filed by a woman with a fractured rib, correct?" Ellis blinked. "Yes," he said, softer than before, "and she was black." The lawyer added with clinical precision. "Yes," Ellis repeated, this time without lifting his gaze from the water. "I made a call based on what I thought was proportional." The room stayed quiet long enough for the sound tech to glance up, confused, as if someone had cut the feed. The phrase, "I made a call," wasn't just inadequate, it was a linguistic crime scene. It suggested discretion where there should have been process, instinct where there should have been accountability. The committee chair finally spoke again. "Captain, do you recall how many total complaints were filed against Officer Halverson under your command?" Ellis hesitated. "More than a dozen," he said. "Do you recall acting on any of them?" He didn't answer. "Let the record show the witness has chosen to remain silent on that question," the clerk noted, pen scraping fast across the lined transcript sheet. Outside the hearing room, the first push notification landed. "Federal hearing reveals chain of protection behind accused officer." Another followed. "Command cover-up? Testimony sparks deeper inquiry into 2016 incident?" It didn't take long for the soundbite to go viral. A local reporter, young, sharp, and relentless, posted the quote from Ellis's lips in bold Helvetica over a stark black background. "I thought he was just too aggressive." Underneath, the caption read, "Too aggressive, how weak language covers strong violence." By lunch break, the phrase, "too aggressive," had been dissected on 3 news panels. One anchor called it the linguistic version of shrugging off blood. Another guest, a retired federal judge, said simply, "There is no such thing as mild brutality." That's a contradiction in terms. But it was a journalist from a progressive legal blog who framed the moment best. Her headline read, "The slippery slope of soft authority." When silence becomes the strongest, back inside the building, the committee resumed. This time, the questioning shifted. It wasn't just about Brandt anymore. It was about the scaffolding that had held him up, kept him in position and given him more rope instead of pulling it tight. A former HR investigator was brought forward. She had flagged Brandt's file twice, once in 2018 and again in 2020, noting patterns of escalation, but her reviews were delayed indefinitely. When asked why, she responded, "Those flags didn't align with command-level priorities." "What were those priorities?" someone asked. She smiled tightly. "Closing cases, looking tough on crime, not investigating our own." Each answer felt like an iron bar driven into the floor, framing a cage in real time. The narrative was no longer about one bad cop. It was about the factory that minted him, wrapped him in policy, and shipped him out with full immunity. A senator from Illinois, normally measured, leaned forward and said flatly, "This isn't just about the gun, it's about who kept handing him bullets." No one interrupted. A screen behind the panel lit up with a spreadsheet. Names, dates, actions taken, actions not taken. In column after column, Brandt's name was cross-listed next to commanders, watch supervisors, and internal compliance officers. Every empty cell in the disciplinary action column was now filled with the word "none" stamped in red. The air in the hearing room had shifted, thickened by the weight of what had just been said and what was yet to come. The silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate, an indictment in itself. One by one, heads began to turn toward the panel of review officers. Their faces tightened not with surprise, but with the burden of recognizing the role they too had played in letting silence metastasize into harm. The man on the witness stand, once a symbol of order, sat like a stone figure cracked from within. He tried to lift his eyes from the table, but failed. The microphones picked up the sound of his swallow, loud in the absence of any other voice. Then a voice cut through the stillness, not loud, not angry, but resolute. "When you chose not to act," one panelist said, "you weren't neutral. You were permitted." The commander flinched. Words had never felt like shrapnel until now. From the gallery, journalists scratched notes feverishly. The quote was already forming into a headline in their minds, a line meant to etch itself into public record. The commander's defense attorney shifted in his seat, as if to gesture toward objecting. But there was no legal ground to stand on. What could be said? That he didn't know what Brandt Halverson had done? That would crumble under a single document from the now unsealed files. That he didn't intend for others to get hurt? Too late. That he had just been following protocol. The very protocol is now exposed as complicit. So he said nothing, not even a breath. Outside, the courthouse steps had become a congregation of quiet outrage. Victims' families held pictures, not signs. No slogans, just names, just faces, just proof. Inside, the hearing resumed with a forensic analyst presenting evidence, a series of digital trail logs showing the commander's login history into the internal complaint database. Each access matched a day when a formal complaint had been filed. Each log confirmed what everyone now knew. He saw, he read, and he did nothing. The timestamps flashed on the screen like a heartbeat of neglect, one ignored pulse after another. At one point, the analyst's pointer paused on an entry marked April 7, 2017, 8 minutes after a report was submitted by a junior officer. It had flagged excessive force used by Brandt on a teenager during a routine stop. The entry was reviewed, then deleted. No one moved. The screen behind the analyst didn't just show lines of data. It showed moments when someone could have stepped in. Instead, what it captured was the architecture of silence, cold, calculated, and fully aware. "You had a choice," a female member of the panel said quietly. "At every stage, you had a choice. And you chose not to disrupt the system that protected him." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. It was the sound of accountability itself. Measured, clear, undeniable. The commander gripped the edge of the witness box, not to defend himself, but to steady what was left of his composure. A younger officer, now in uniform but once a cadet under the commander's watch, was called to testify next. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he spoke. "We were told to be loyal, upward, not to question, but we knew. We whispered about Brandt in the locker rooms. We joked, but not because it was funny, because If we didn't, we'd explode. His face flushed red. He called them hard stops. We knew what that meant. No cameras, no paperwork. Just pain. The commander didn't interrupt. He didn't deny. He didn't even blink. He stared forward, eyes glassy, haunted by the words from someone who once saw him as a mentor. The hearing recessed for a break. The commander remained seated, shoulders sagging, hands unclenched and open on the table. Across the room, Lydia stood in the shadows, not on the witness list, not in the spotlight, but there nonetheless. Marcus stood beside her. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Lydia's silence, like her stare months ago in the square, wasn't passive. It was pressure. It was present. Marcus leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "He built the wall. Now he gets to feel it fall." As the panel reconvened, one final piece of testimony was introduced, an internal memo drafted in 2019 that recommended disciplinary action against Brent. The memo had been authored by a mid-level administrator who testified that the commander had acknowledged receipt in person. He said he'd handle it internally, the administrator recounted, but nothing happened. The next time I heard of it, Brent had been recommended for the word commendation echoed like a curse. On the panel's table, someone scribbled a note in bold ink. Reward for silence? The final exchange came not from a lawyer or witness, but from a member of the Civilian Review Board. An older man, a retired teacher, leaned forward and asked the commander directly, "If you had acted when you should have, how many names wouldn't be carved into those photos outside?" The commander, eyes glistening, opened his mouth, but no words came out. Just breathe. Just regret. Just the void left by too many maybe. And with that, the room was dismissed. Not with a bang, but with the scrape of chairs and the slow shuffle of realization. The silence that followed wasn't just silence. It was a reckoning. It hung in the air, dense and leaden, like the weight of a verdict not yet spoken, but already known. The room did not breathe, not one shuffle of shoes, not a murmur from the gallery. Every pair of eyes, judges, journalists, citizens, was fixed on the man who had once wielded authority with a flick of a pen and a nod of neglect. His uniform sat awkwardly on his frame now, the fabric suddenly too formal, too loud in its symbolism. He shifted in his chair, aware that every movement echoed louder in that suffocating quiet. The junior representative leaned into the microphone, his voice deliberate. "So, Commander Herron, to clarify, you're saying you reviewed complaints with sufficient concern to remember them, but you found them too minor to pursue further action?" The older man's jaw twitched. He nodded once, slowly, as if the nod itself might change the angle of guilt. "At the time, yes," he muttered. "They didn't strike me as operationally urgent." A buzz went through the press section, quiet but unmistakable, the soft sound of keyboards, flaring to life, capturing the phrasing, the cracks. Not urgent, not actionable, not enough. Words that would stretch across tomorrow's headlines like banners. And yet, the representative continued, flipping a page for the theater of it, those very complaints described physical force without justification, repeated racial targeting, and falsified statements on official reports. And your decision was, what? To flag them? Commander Herron's shoulders slumped by millimeters. "To monitor the situation," he said, eyes now fixed on a point beyond the wood-paneled wall. "To speak with him off record. To assess developmentally." The phrase hit the room like a slap. One woman in the back row, a former precinct auditor, closed her eyes. Another man, seated next to the window with a translator's earpiece, shook his head once, slowly, developmentally, as if excessive force was a phase, as if trauma were a learning curve, as if dead bodies were mere collateral damage in the growth chart of institutional power. Lydia was not in the room, but her name was on every face. The ripple of her actions, of not flinching, of choosing visibility over fear, had become the metric by which all this was now being measured. Her silence had detonated into a movement. Her file, her voice, her defiance, all traced back to moments that men like Herron had dismissed with a tired rubber stamp. The chair of the hearing leaned forward. "You said earlier that you believed Officer Halverson was simply overzealous, The reports lacked sufficient evidence. That it was, and I quote, not your place to derail a promising officer's momentum. The chair paused, letting that line sink in. Do you now believe that was a misjudgment? Heron did not respond immediately. Then, quieter voice, he said, I believe I misunderstood the cost of inaction. No one applauded, no one nodded, because admission wasn't redemption. It was late, and it was forced. It wasn't bravery, it was a cornered truth. Outside, reporters readied their live feeds. The headline from earlier still blazed across digital tickers. From overzealous to systemic, the thin line of complicity. Social media boiled with threads unraveling old names, old cases, old excuses. Activists began circulating petitions before the gavel fell. Nothing would return what had been lost. But the machinery that had hidden behind procedure now found itself pierced, slowly, surgically by its protocols. As the committee adjourned, a single camera flashed. Not for Heron, not for the judge, but for the empty seat left intentionally next to the witness stand, a symbolic space reserved for those who could no longer speak. 4 photos rested against the leg of the chair. A mother with a son in a hoodie, a veteran holding a discharge letter, a teenager on life support, and a child with a bruised jawline. Beside them was a handwritten card that simply read, "They asked for help, we filed them away." In that image, that collection of the silenced would do what testimony never could. It would haunt, it would headline, it would live on in exhibits and textbooks and mandatory training slides. It would become the ghost in every unchecked report, the face in every denial of wrongdoing. Heron, exiting through the private corridor, did not look back, but the world already had the only angle it needed. The room was quiet, not the forced hush of order, but the natural vacuum that follows too many truths laid bare. Brent Halverson sat at the center of the hearing chamber, shoulders slumped beneath a gray suit that no longer conferred power. The man who once barked orders into radios now stared ahead, with pupils ringed in red and skin bleached by sleepless nights. There were no badges flanking him, no partners behind him. Just an empty chair to his right and a jug of untouched water to his left. The Federal Disciplinary Committee, 7 members across the mahogany curve, didn't need to bang a gavel. Silence had already cuffed him. The lead committee officer adjusted her mic, leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Halverson," she began, voice even, deliberate. "You've been presented with the findings of the investigation. Do you have any comments?" Brent inhaled. The sound was shaky, like breath trying to lift a weight far too heavy for the chest it resided in. He swallowed but did not speak. The woman waited. 10 seconds stretched into 20. She asked again, this time slightly sharper. "Do you wish to make a statement on behalf of your actions during the years 2016 to 2023? Still no words. Brent blinked, then mouthed something indecipherable. Then finally, he rasped, "No." That one word didn't fall. It cracked. Across the room, a soft movement broke the freeze. A woman rose from the public seating row. Mid-50s, tightly curled hair streaked with gray, back held straight by pain endured more than posture. Her voice carried not volume but precision. "That," she said, "is what you told me when I asked for water." Heads turned. Even the stenographer lifted her gaze. "June 14, 2019, the woman continued. "I was in the back of your patrol car. Wrist cut from your cuffs. Nose broken. Face swollen. I asked for a drink. You looked at me, then said, 'No.'" The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. Brent closed his eyes, but the image wouldn't leave. The woman stayed standing. "That's the day my vocal cords ruptured. You didn't report the ambulance delay. You said I was resisting. You filled that report with words. And now, when you could use them to acknowledge something, anything, you say nothing." She sat down. The wood of her chair creaked, but Brent didn't flinch. His face had hardened into something between guilt and stubbornness, a mask forged too long ago to be removed in public. A second voice spoke. "Younger. Male? My brother's not here to ask anything, because he died the day after you tackled him, for walking with his hood up." The man stood but did not look at Brent. He looked at the panel. "We don't want apologies. We want acknowledgement, and today, we're told, This man has none. He paused, then added, but we've memorized his tone, that cold certainty. We lived with it in our nightmares long before it became a headline. From the far right of the panel, a retired judge leaned into his mic. Mr. Halverson, do you deny the accounts presented here? Brant's jaw clenched. I don't remember. A scoff escaped from someone in the crowd. The judge didn't blink. Convenient, he said, then flipped a page on the docket. Because according to this, you signed every line, initialed every margin, and in several instances, handwrote the words "strong response" required before any resistance was recorded. The room held steady. It didn't need rage. The weight of what had been documented, pain inked in bureaucracy, was heavier than any scream. Brent's breath hitched again. The corners of his mouth twitched as though trying to frame some defense. None came. And then the chairwoman spoke again. We are not here to punish feeling. We are here to weigh conduct. But your silence, Mr. Halverson, speaks volumes about your recognition, or lack thereof, of what you did while wearing that uniform. Someone coughed. A clock ticked. Then the woman from earlier, the one with the broken voice, raised her phone. I recorded this, she said. The day he slammed me to the ground, it survived in my cloud backups even when my phone was smashed. She pressed play. The audio was tinny, muffled, but clear enough. A man shouting, "Get down! Shut up!" Then a thud, then a moan, then another voice, her own, hoarse and terrified, asking, "Please, can I have some water?" And then, unmistakably, Brent's voice, "No." When the clip ended, Brent sat motionless. His eyes darted, but his body was cemented. A new kind of silence bloomed, one not from restraint, but from reckoning. The committee conferred in whispers. Then, after a long minute, the chairwoman announced, "This tribunal will reconvene in 48 hours to deliver findings. Mr. Halverson, you are dismissed from the stand." Brent did not stand right away. When he did, it was mechanical. A bailiff escorted him toward the side door, his shoes echoing louder than his entire testimony. As he reached the threshold, the man who had lost his brother whispered, not loud enough for the room, but just enough for the shadow of justice to hear. It wasn't the silence that hurt most. It was how comfortable you were in it. The door closed. The chamber exhaled, not in relief, but in the door behind Brent shut with a metallic finality, sealing in the testimonies that had stripped his uniform far more thoroughly than any administrative order ever could. His shoes scuffed against the marble as he descended the back stairwell, every step sounding like the closing of a file, the snapping of a page against air. He didn't count the stairs. He didn't have to. His body did it for him, muscle memory clinging to procedure even when purpose had evaporated. Halfway down, the silence broke, not with voices, not with applause, but with presence. Marcus stood with one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding a small, sealed envelope. He was not blocking the path, but his presence filled the staircase like smoke, impossible to bypass without inhaling something heavy. His eyes, always steady, now looked through Brent rather than at him. Not a stare, a sentence. Brent stopped. His gaze dropped to the envelope without reaching for it. Marcus didn't flinch. He extended his hand, the FBI seal on the flap glinting under the fluorescent light. 6 recovered files, he said flatly. The ones you tried to white. Audio's intact. Enough to hear your voice rise before anyone else had a chance to speak. Brent reached for the envelope. His fingers brushed the seal, but he didn't open it, didn't speak, didn't blink. Marcus watched him, waited, and then added, his voice low, precise, not angry but surgical. Don't disappear. Don't run. Don't end this. You need to live long enough to hear yourself in every scream you buried. There was no malice in his tone, no glee, just the cold precision of justice served without flame. Brent's lips parted slightly, as if to ask a question, but the words fossilized before they reached the air. He looked at the envelope again, now in his hand, now heavier than it had any right to be. Brant turned it over. The seal was clean. No threats written across it, no red tape, no commands. Just the simple weight of everything he thought he'd erased, now documented, backed up, archived, and returned. Marcus said nothing more. He turned and walked up the stairs, each step deliberate, as if leaving Brent to the gravity he'd created. Brent remained frozen, on a step, not too high, not too low, between the place he'd been and the place he was told to face. For the first time, no one was pushing him in either direction. The weight of the decision sat squarely on his shoulders. No sirens, no crowds, just a man holding proof of his voice, the kind that no longer obeyed him. He moved again, but not up, not down, just enough to sit, elbow on knee, envelope still in hand, his fingers pressed against the flap as if trying to feel its contents through sheer pressure. His chest rose and fell more slowly now. The envelope didn't burn, but it throbbed in his palm like a pulse. These weren't papers. These were echoes. Screams, demands, pleas, voices he'd silenced now returned in digital fidelity. Every time he muted a mic, every time he turned off a camera, every time he erased a clip, a log, a signature. Now, the silence screamed back. The stairwell was lit with dull institutional lighting, clean, bright, sterile, but it felt like a cell. No bars, no locks, just decisions, and air so still it might snap. He thought of the hearing, of the woman with the broken voice, of the man who never said his brother's name. He thought of the way the room had quieted, not because of verdicts, but because silence had been turned into a verdict itself. And now this stairwell was no longer an escape, it was a sentence. Downstairs, the hallway led to the street. Upstairs, to the chambers, where his name still echoed in memorandums and witness logs. But here, this middle space, was his purgatory. A man who had once moved people with a gesture, a shout, a badge, now moved no one has moved, and even his breath felt borrowed. He finally opened the envelope. The flap peeled back with the dry sigh of paper pulled from its sleep. Inside were 6 printed transcripts, stapled, time-stamped, and annotated, and a small black flash drive. No label, just wait. He didn't read the pages yet. He couldn't, but he stared at the top line of the first. Incident 4/downtown alley/no cam present/audio extracted. His name followed as the primary enforcer, and then, underlined, subject demeaned non-complice. Force initiated. His throat tightened, not from emotion, from memory, from the muscle that remembered yelling those words, the hand that remembered writing them. Somewhere above him Marcus was gone. Somewhere behind him the system he'd used like a fortress was now an archive of evidence. And somewhere ahead, the world waited to see if Brent Halverson would finally speak something that wasn't a command or a denial. He didn't know if he could, but he knew now that silence had stopped being his defense. It had become part of the charge. He ran his thumb along the edge of the top transcript, the paper slicing lightly against his skin, as if to remind him that even truth could bleed. He considered the flash drive, black, unassuming, but packed with the parts of himself he'd hidden even from his memory. He wondered if he had ever heard those screams when they happened, or if he had already tuned them out before they formed words. Somewhere in those files was the truth about what kind of man he had been, unfiltered by uniform or title, and now that truth waited to be heard again, not for punishment, but for proof. He pressed the flash drive into his pocket and stood. The stairs no longer looked like an escape or a tomb. They looked like what they had always been, steps, and he had one choice now, to climb, to descend, or to remain. A soft rustle above startled him. Footsteps. Someone else is in the stairwell. He didn't recognize the gait. Slow, steady, with a rhythm that wasn't urgent, but deliberate. Brent didn't turn around. He didn't need to. Whoever it was had seen him, and he'd been seen enough today to know what that meant. No masks left, no authority shield. Just Brent, alone, with an envelope full of screams and a hallway full of silence. He took the first step down. It felt heavier than it should have. Not from regret, he wasn't sure he deserved that yet, but from recognition, acknowledgement, the burden of memory unmuted. The world would keep turning, but Brent Halverson would walk into it now, no longer in command, no longer defended by rank. He would walk into it with proof of who he was, and maybe, just maybe, with enough time, he could begin to understand what it would mean to truly listen, not for justice, not even for forgiveness, but simply because some echoes refused to die quietly. Behind him, the hearing continued. Other names, other files, other misuses of power, now cracked open under fluorescent lights and recorded minutes. But none of that reached Brent. His entire courtroom was now internal. The trial had shifted inward. Every stare creaked with what he'd overlooked. Every breath reminded him of those he'd taken too freely while others gasped for theirs. And Marcus, the man who once held a badge just like his, had not shouted, had not pushed, had only placed a mirror where Brent once held a weapon. For years, Brent had believed silence was control, that muting a suspect meant winning, that turning off a body cam meant reclaiming the narrative. But the tapes never really vanished. The system, even when cracked, had memory, and now that memory had shape, had a voice, had form. The difference was, Brent could no longer claim ignorance, and ignorance was no longer his shield, it was his confession. Outside the courthouse, the press waited like wolves, but not for Brent. The story had shifted beyond him. The cameras would follow the implications, the names and the transcripts and the leadership that had looked away. Brent was no longer the headline. He was the footnote, a caution, a figure of collapse. He knew it too, which was why, as he finally pushed open the side door into the crisp afternoon air, he didn't look for an exit strategy. He stood in the sunlight, envelope still in hand, and, for once, didn't shield his face, because for the first time, there was nothing left to hide. The wind moved past him like a whisper, one he could not command or silence. It brushed against his collar and ruffled the papers slightly, a reminder that the world still moved, still spoke, even when he did not. He closed his eyes, not to avoid what came next, but to feel it more clearly. No badges, no buzzers, no clipped orders barking down the hallway, just footsteps behind, traffic ahead, and the rising realization that every day forward would not erase, but require reckoning. Brent inhaled deeply, the air colder than expected, and walked forward, not toward redemption, but toward responsibility. He would not ask to be understood. He would not beg to be forgiven. He would begin by listening to the voices he had once spoken over, and maybe, by living through the truth, he would finally learn what silence was meant for, not to protect the powerful, but to honor the ones who had none. The key turned, but the door didn't budge. Brent frowned, tried again, slower this time, as if patience could coax the mechanism to recognize him. The lock resisted, mechanical, impersonal, final. He stepped back, and for the first time since childhood looked at the front of his own house as a stranger. A white sheet of paper fluttered in the wind, pinned to the doorframe with blue tape, printed in stark type, temporary property, seizure order, pending. Internal Federal Review. Below it, a stamp in red, executed. He reached for the knob, almost out of habit, but stopped himself. The air had changed. What once smelled like cut grass and worn leather now felt sterile, erased. No photographs hung in the windows. No porch light flickered in welcome. The door hadn't just been locked, it had been silenced. He pressed the bell. No sound. He knocked. Still no answer. There was no one inside. Or if there was, they had already moved on. From him, Brent stepped back onto the sidewalk, phone in hand. He tapped his sister's name, straight to voicemail. He tried again, rejected. He scrolled, found his father's number. Let it ring, and die. He looked around, expecting a neighbor's curtain to twitch, a dog to bark, something to acknowledge his presence, but the world had turned its face. Even the trees seemed to lean away. He sat on the curb, elbows on knees, forehead resting on the bridge of his hands. He felt the edges of something crumpled inside his jacket, reached in and pulled out the folded scrap. It was worn at the corners, the ink slightly smudged. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Marcus, the man who had handed him justice, not like a weapon, but like a mirror. Brent unfolded the paper and read the line that hit harder than any reprimand, sharper than any verdict. This is the first time you've been forced to listen. He stared at it, read it again. The ink didn't change. The weight of the sentence deepened. It didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It didn't absolve. It simply existed, like the silence in his house. The voicemail left unanswered, the hallway no longer echoing his commands. Brent didn't crumple the note. He didn't tear it. He folded it slowly, reverently, and slipped it back into his coat. Because for all his years enforcing silence, he'd never truly understood what it meant to be muted by choice, by everyone else's. He looked back at the house. His house, but it no longer spoke that name. It had expelled him without rage, without sound, just like the note, just like Marcus, just like justice itself. When it's real, it doesn't yell. It simply stops opening the door. He stood again, slower now, as if his legs carried more than just body weight. He circled the perimeter of the house, stopping at each window, curtains drawn, lights off, no motion behind the glass. But more than that, no memory stared back. Not a single picture frame left, not a smudge on the glass from a child's hand, not even the dull hum of a refrigerator. It had been cleared, not out of protocol, but out of permanence. He tried the back gate, locked, tried the garage code, error. Each denial layered upon the last, until the whole house became a monument to what was lost, not through fire or rage or force, but through absence, through the quiet, unanimous decision of a life no longer willing to include him. He returned to the front step and sat, not to wait, just to exist. People passed. No one greeted him. A jogger switched sides of the street without breaking pace. A mail carrier left letters at the next house, then glanced at Brent and paused, not out of fear, but calculation, then moved on. He checked his phone again. No notifications, no alerts, no corrections. He was no longer someone to correct, just someone to observe from a distance. He scrolled through old texts, saw blue bubbles unanswered, then grayed out numbers with not delivered warnings. Somewhere in the mess of unreturned calls and legal documents, he'd crossed a threshold. Out of reach, out of relevance. He looked at the note once more. The words did not hurt. They rang. Truth didn't cut like glass. It hummed, and now that he was no longer shouting, he could hear it. Brent exhaled and stood. The door hadn't locked him out. It had moved on. And now, so must he. Not as an officer, not even as a defendant, but as a man whose echo no longer controlled the air. He left the envelope on the doorstep, turned, and walked away. The house did not look back. The door of the chamber clicked shut with the hush of 1,000 held breaths. Lydia Monroe stepped forward, not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but as something fiercer, the end of a sentence no one dared to punctuate. Her heels struck the marble with the gravity of a gavel. No aide flanked her, no note swayed her down, no script guided her voice. She wore no mask of emotion, only the calm that comes from standing in fire and not burning. As she faced the council, a semicircle of suits and silence, she didn't glance at the microphone. She didn't adjust her posture. She didn't ask to be heard. She simply was, and that was enough to still the room. Officials sat with expressions crafted by decades of dispassion, eyebrows neutral, hands steepled, attention sharpened by scandal but dulled by bureaucracy. Some shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort but from an instinctive awareness that this was not an ordinary hearing. Lydia did not bow to formalities. She did not acknowledge the titles or the theater. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It didn't need to be. It moved through the chamber like a crack-splitting glass. Silence is not consent, she said, and the air turned electric. Silence is not forgiveness. Sometimes, silence is the sound of a scream too loud for your systems to process. Sometimes, silence is the fracture that makes your walls collapse. And sometimes, she paused, letting the stillness hang like judgment. It is the explosion you mistook for peace. No one moved. No one dared interrupt, because at that moment she wasn't addressing the panel. She was addressing every bystander who watched injustice and blinked. She was speaking to every system that confused restraint with weakness, every headline that sanitized brutality with passive voice. She was a blade honed by omission, a voice carved from decades of being told to wait, to calm down, to file complaints no one read. There was no anger in her tone, only clarity, and that, more than any outrage, made her terrifying. Outside, the words were already moving faster than she was. One journalist mouthed the phrase as she wrote it down, fingers trembling, knowing it would be printed before the day was done. "Silence is the explosion you mistook for peace." That line would headline the evening broadcast, looped across national news, dissected by pundits, turned into thesis material for college students who had never felt a hand on their throat but wanted to understand what it meant to breathe only when allowed. A ninth-grade civics teacher would print the quote and pin it to the corkboard between the Constitution and a photo of Rosa Parks. Somewhere in a dorm room, a girl would write it in permanent marker above her desk, her hands steady for the first time all semester. The council members didn't ask her to elaborate. They couldn't. Any attempt to follow would have sounded like an apology or excuse, and this moment tolerated neither. Her presence had become an indictment, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't have to. Not because she demanded power, but because she was power, unshaken, unowned, unmistakable. Her silence after speaking rang louder than any closing argument. Her gaze didn't flinch. Her hands didn't tremble. She gave them nothing but truth, and it gutted them. As she turned to leave, the microphones caught nothing more. The echo of her words did the rest. In homes across the country, her face lit up television screens as newscasters fumbled to capture the gravity of her speech. But the footage needed no commentary. It didn't require context. The nation saw one woman stand still, speak once, and shift the axis of accountability. By nightfall, newspapers would run her sentence in bold across their front pages. "Silence is the explosion you mistook for peace." 3 students would use it in graduation speeches. One judge would quote it in a sentencing. The words were not hers anymore. They belonged to a movement that had waited too long to be named. And Lydia Monroe didn't look back. She didn't need to. The words still lingered like an aftershock when the ruling was delivered, not with drama, not with fanfare, but with a cold finality that echoed louder than a gavel. In the official transcript of the proceedings, there was no name, no Brent Halverson, no rank, no badge, only a sequence of numbers and dates, a sterile string of characters that stripped him of what he had once weaponized, identity. It wasn't erasure. It was exile from relevance, not forgotten, but disqualified from remembrance. The court had chosen silence, not to protect, but to condemn, to ensure that no martyr could rise from the ruins, no myth could fester in the margins, no sympathy could ferment in the vacuum left behind. The man who once barked orders and snapped wrists, who made street corners his kingdom and uniforms his armor, now existed only as a file. No photographs, no citations, no commendations. Just a case number locked in a federal archive, marked with restricted access and red ink. His name had become too loud to be spoken, too dangerous to be remembered. This was not justice by spectacle. It was justice by design, ruthless in its precision, poetic in its refusal to glorify the guilty. And as the verdict concluded, Lydia Monroe rose from her seat, not to applause, not to flashbulbs, but to silence, the kind that does not ache but affirms. Her footsteps did not claim history. She didn't glance back. She didn't linger for commentary. She didn't balk, because this was never about spectacle. She had stood where she needed to stand, spoken what needed to be said, and now she let the silence speak louder than the verdict. Outside the chamber, the hallway stretched wide and quiet. She walked alone as she had arrived. No escort, no entourage, only purpose. When she reached the end of the corridor, she paused, not for reflection, but for closure. With deliberate care, she reached for the lapel of her jacket and removed the small gleaming badge that had sat there since the beginning. The weight of duty fulfilled, now held between her fingers. She placed it into a plain envelope, unadorned, unsealed. No signature, no ceremony. On the envelope, in her precise handwriting, she wrote a single line: "The role is done. It is time for the law to perform the rest." Then, without hesitation, she left it on the receptionist's desk of the Department of Justice and walked away, not as a victor, not as a symbol, but as a citizen once more. Not retreating, but releasing. The law would carry forward. The storm had passed, the echo remained.